The kitchen was a tomb of shadows lit only by the faint glow of a single bulb above the sink. Clara Hensley stood there, her hands pressed against the cold counter, staring out the window into the endless sea of wheat that swallowed her farm. The wind hissed through the stalks, a restless murmur, but it was Rune's howl that cut through her sharp raw, like a blade slicing through the fog of her grief. It came from the far field where the old oak stood alone, a gnarled silhouette against the bruised autumn sky. She didn't move, didn't blink, her breath shallow, as if afraid to disturb the sound. Each note of Rune's cry was a question she couldn't answer, a call to something she'd buried with Ezra. The clock ticked above the stove, its hands heavy, counting down to nothing. Clara pulled her shawl tighter, stepping into the frost that clung to the earth like a second skin. The wheat whispered as she moved its golden tips, brushing her thighs, each stalk a memory of summers, when Ezra ran through these fields, laughing, Rune bounding at his heels. Now the air was sharp, biting her knuckles as she followed the faint trail of broken stems. The oak loomed ahead, its branches clawing at the stars. There Rune stood, his silver-flecked fur ghostly in the moonlight, his head tilted back in a howl that seemed to pull the night apart. His eyes, when they flicked toward her, held no recognition, just a deep, searching ache. The field felt alive, its whispers coiling around her, as if guarding a secret she wasn't ready to touch. Clara's knees buckled slightly as she crouched behind a cluster of wheat stalks, the frost seeping through her boots like fingers from a grave. Rune's howl faded into a whimper, his body curling tighter against the oak's roots, as if the tree itself were his last anchor. In her mind, the sound twisted into Ezra's voice, young, vibrant, calling Rune back from a romp in the fields. "Boy, come here!" He'd laugh, his hand ruffling the dog's ears, the two of them inseparable shadows against the sunset. But that was before the silence swallowed everything, before the search parties returned, empty-handed, before her world shrank to this numb shell. Her fingers dug into the earth, cold and unyielding, mirroring the knot in her chest that wouldn't unravel. Why this spot? Why every night? The questions clawed at her, but she swallowed them, her breath hitching in quiet, ragged bursts. Tears pricked her eyes, not falling, just hovering like storm clouds she refused to release. She clutched her shawl, the fabric worn thin from endless nights like this, whispering Ezra's name into the wind, as if it could carry her plea to wherever he was. Rune's eyes met hers for a fleeting second, dark pools reflecting her own hollow gaze, and something inside her cracked, not loudly, but like ice underfoot, subtle and irreversible. She wanted to turn back, to retreat to the farmhouse's empty rooms, but her legs wouldn't move. The grief long suppressed rose in waves, washing over her in silent tremors, leaving her exposed, vulnerable to whatever secret the dog guarded here. Rune's howl cut short, his head, snapping up, ears pricked toward the field's distant edge, where the shadows pooled like spilled ink. Clara froze, her heart thudding in her ears as the dog's gaze pierced the darkness, unblinking alert. A low growl rumbled from his throat, not aggressive but wary, like a warning whispered to the night. She followed his stare, seeing nothing at first, just the sway of wheat under the moon, but then a flicker, a shape detaching from the crumbling stone wall. Peter stood there, half hidden, his broad shoulders, hunched eyes fixed on Rune with a weight that spoke of burdens unspoken. He didn't move closer, just watched his face, a mask of guilt etched in moonlight, the lines around his mouth deepening, as if holding back words that could shatter the fragile quiet. Clara didn't notice him, her focus locked on Rune, but the dog did, his muscles tensing, a subtle shift that promised upheaval. The air thickened, charged with the sense of eyes upon eyes, secrets circling like vultures. Rune's growl softened, but his stare lingered, pulling Clara forward one hesitant step toward the oak, toward whatever truth waited in the soil. The farmhouse kitchen smelled of stale coffee and forgotten bread, but in Clara's mind, it still carried the ghost of cinnamon rolls baking on Sunday mornings, when Ezra's laughter filled the air like sunlight-piercing storm clouds. 2 years ago, the world had been whole. Ezra, her only child, a lanky boy of 16, with her stubborn chin and his father's easy grin, racing through the wheat fields on his bike, Rune trotting faithfully beside him, tongue lolling in joyful exhaustion. They'd been inseparable boy and dog building forts from hay bales, chasing fireflies under the summer stars that seemed to wink promises of forever. Clara remembered the way Ezra's hands, already calloused from farm work, would ruffle Rune's fur, the dog's eyes gleaming with unwavering loyalty. "He's my shadow, Ma," Ezra would say, his voice cracking with adolescent pride, and she'd smile, her heart swelling like the river after rain. The farmhouse kitchen smelled of stale coffee and forgotten bread, but in Clara's mind it still carried the ghost of cinnamon rolls baking on Sunday mornings, when Ezra's laughter filled the air like sunlight piercing storm clouds. 2 years ago, the world had been whole. Ezra, her only child, a lanky boy of 16 with her stubborn chin and his father's easy grin, racing through the wheat fields on his bike, Rune trotting faithfully beside him, tongue lolling in joyful exhaustion. They'd been inseparable boy and dog building forts from hay bales, chasing fireflies under the summer stars that seemed to wink promises of forever. Clara remembered the way Ezra's hands, already calloused from farm work, would ruffle Rune's fur, the dog's eyes gleaming with unwavering loyalty. "He's my shadow, Ma," Ezra would say, his voice cracking with adolescent pride, and she'd smile, her heart swelling like the river after rain. The farmhouse kitchen smelled of stale coffee and forgotten bread, but in Clara's mind it still carried the ghost of cinnamon rolls baking on Sunday mornings, when Ezra's laughter filled the air like sunlight piercing storm clouds. 2 years ago, the world had been whole. Ezra, her only child, a lanky boy of 16, with her stubborn chin and his father's easy grin, racing through the wheat fields on his bike, Rune trotting faithfully beside him, tongue lolling in joyful exhaustion. They'd been inseparable boy and dog building forts from hay bales, chasing fireflies under the summer stars that seemed to wink promises of forever. Clara remembered the way Ezra's hands, already calloused from farm work, would ruffle Rune's fur, the dog's eyes gleaming with unwavering loyalty. "He's my shadow, Ma," Ezra would say, his voice cracking with adolescent pride, and she'd smile, her heart swelling like the river after rain. In the dim light of the farmhouse porch, Clara and Rune existed as echoes of each other. Two silhouettes carved from the same stone of sorrow, their emptiness a shared language spoken in silences and averted eyes. Clara's days were a ritual of avoidance, sweeping floors that were already clean, staring at the horizon where the wheat met the sky, her hands idle but clenched as if holding on to ghosts. Rune mirrored her, pacing the yard's perimeter, his steps measured and wary, pausing only to glance at the field that called to him like a siren song. Both flinched at sudden noises. The crack of a branch underfoot sent Clara's heart racing, memories of the fire's roar flooding back, while Rune's ears flattened, his body tensing as if bracing for another abandonment. Their healing, if it could be called that, began in these quiet parallels. Clara leaving a bowl of water untouched by the steps, Rune lapping at it from afar, neither demanding more than the other's presence. In the dim light of the farmhouse porch, Clara and Rune existed as echoes of each other, two silhouettes carved from the same stone of sorrow, their emptiness a shared language, spoken in silences and averted eyes. Clara's days were a ritual of avoidance, sweeping floors that were already clean, staring at the horizon where the wheat met the sky, her hands idle but clenched as if holding on to ghosts. Rune mirrored her, pacing the yard's perimeter, his steps measured and wary, pausing only to glance at the field that called to him like a siren's song. Both flinched at sudden noises. The crack of a branch underfoot sent Clara's heart racing, memories of the fire's roar flooding back, while Rune's ears flattened, his body tensing as if bracing for another abandonment. Their healing, if it could be called that, began in these quiet parallels, Clara leaving a bowl of water untouched by the steps, Rune lapping at it from afar, neither demanding more than the other's presence. Clara stood frozen at the edge of the frenzy, rain streaming down her face like unshed tears, her mind a battlefield where fear clashed with the faint spark of compassion. Why now, she thought, her hands trembling around the lantern's handle, turn back. Let the storm bury whatever lies there, preserve the numbness that's kept you alive. Logic screamed retreat, digging would only unearth more pain, more reminders of Ezra's absence, and caring for Rune meant opening a door she'd nailed shut, inviting the vulnerability that had nearly broken her before. but Rune's eyes locked on hers, dark and imploring, his paws caked in mud, body shivering not just from cold but from a desperation that echoed her own hidden ache. A subtle shift, a soft whine piercing the thunder, his head tilting as if begging her to see him, to see the connection, tipped the scale. Empathy won fragile and fierce, overriding the fear. She couldn't leave him alone in this chaos, not when his persistence mirrored her unspoken longing for answers. Clara dropped the lantern, its light sputtering in the mud as she knelt beside Rune, her hands plunging into the slick earth without thought, nails scraping against roots and stones. Rain pounded her back like accusations, but she dug, fingers intertwining with Rune's paws in a chaotic rhythm, his frantic scratches splattering her with dirt, her own efforts clumsy, slipping in the torrent, the hole deepened, imperfectly uneven edges collapsing inward. But she persisted, a growl of determination escaping her lips as lightning flashed, revealing the rusted tin box, half emerged, its lid dented and defiant. Rune paused, his nose nudging her arm, a tentative touch that sealed the shift. She grabbed the box, yanking it free with a wet suck of mud. Her breath ragged, the act irreversible, now binding her to the dog's quest. Mud caked her skin, rain blurring her vision, but in that mess commitment bloomed raw, unpolished, real. With trembling hands, Clara pried open the tin box, the hinges groaning like a long-held secret, finally released rain pooling inside to mingle with the contents. A tarnished locket, its chain tangled, and a sodden note scrawled in Ezra's hasty script. Rune pressed closer, his wet fur brushing her side, no longer digging, but watching with a stillness that spoke of relief, his breath warm against her chilled skin. Impulsively, she reached out her fingers, hesitating before stroking his head, the touch messy with mud and tears. But he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned in, a soft whine escaping as if acknowledging her care. She offered him space under her shawl, pulling him nearer as the storm raged, their bodies huddling against the oak's trunk, the act impulsive born of the moment's raw need. The first threads of trust wove between them, fragile as spider silk, as Clara whispered promises into the wind. "I'll keep you safe, boy." Her voice cracking the bond, forming in silence, a vow etched in the earth's upheaval. Rune's eyes met hers, the wariness softening, and in that quiet exchange, healing began, irreversible as the unearthed truth. The morning after the storm dawned, crisp and unforgiving, sunlight slicing through the farmhouse windows like a reluctant apology. Clara set a bowl of scraps on the porch, her movements deliberate, avoiding Rune's gaze as he lingered at the yard's edge, his body a taut line of silver-flecked fur. He watched her with guarded eyes, dark pools reflecting the wariness of a creature twice betrayed by fire, by loss, his lips curling slightly in a low growl that rumbled like distant thunder, not aggressive but a boundary etched in sound. Silence stretched between them, thick as the mud still caking her boots, neither initiating contact. Clara turned away, busying herself with chores, her heart echoing his caution, afraid that closeness would reopen wounds long scabbed over. Rune didn't approach the bowl until she was inside his steps, silent, measured, eating quickly with glances over his shoulder, as if trust were a luxury he couldn't afford. Their distance was mutual, a cold veil woven from shared pain where every look was a question unanswered, every pause a reminder of the emptiness they both carried. Yet in that guarded space, something simmered, a silent acknowledgement that neither could heal alone, though neither dared to bridge the gap first. Twilight draped the farm in soft grays, the wheat fields sighing as Clara knelt by the porch, a rag soaked in warm water clutched in her hand. Rune lay a few feet away, his scarred hind leg extended awkwardly, the old wound from the fire, a jagged line of pink flesh amid the fur flaring red from the night's digging. She approached slowly, her breath steady, but her mind a whirl of echoes, Ezra's gentle hands tending to scrape his voice, soothing the dog through storms. Rune tensed, his eyes fixed on her, but he didn't growl, just watched with a stillness that mirrored her own suppressed ache. Gently she dabbed at the wound, the cloth coming away stained, and in that touch their pains intertwined, Clara's grief, a silent flood. Rune's mistrust a quiet flinch. He allowed it, his body rigid but present, as if recognizing her hurt in the tremor of her fingers. The afternoon sun filtered through the kitchen window in lazy shafts, catching the dust motes that danced like forgotten memories. Clara stood at the sink washing a chipped mug, Ezra's favorite, the one with the faded tractor print he'd begged for at the county fair years ago. Her fingers traced the crack, and suddenly it slipped shattering on the floor in a cascade of porcelain shards that echoed like a distant gunshot. She froze the sound, pulling her back a flashback to a summer evening Ezra at 10, dropping a plate during supper, his face crumpling in fear of scolding. But she'd laughed then, kneeling to help Rune bounding in with a playful bark, licking the boy's tears away as if to say, "It's just a thing, not the end." The dog's bark had been light joyful, tying them all in a moment of warmth. Dusk settled over the farm like a soft blanket, the wheat fields glowing amber in the fading light, whispering secrets to the cooling air. Clara sat on the porch steps, a frayed rope toy in her hand, Ezra's old plaything for Rune, unearthed from the shed in a moment of quiet impulse. She tossed it lightly across the yard, not expecting much, the motion mechanical at first, born from habit rather than hope. Rune, lounging in the grass nearby, lifted his head ears, perking at the thud of the toy hitting the earth. He watched it roll his body still, but alert the silver in his fur catching the sunset like embers. Then, unexpectedly, he rose, limping slightly, but with a spark in his eyes, bounding after it in awkward leaps that belied his scars. Clara's lips twitched as he snatched the rope, shaking it fiercely, a playful growl rumbling from his throat, the sound so reminiscent of happier days that a bubble of laughter escaped her light, and foreign like sunlight breaking through clouds after endless rain. It started small, a chuckle at his antics, but grew as Rune trotted back, dropping the toy at her feet with a triumphant huff, his tail wagging in earnest for the first time since the fire. She reached out, accepting the slobbered rope from his mouth, her fingers brushing his muzzle without tension, the contact warm and reassuring. "Again," she murmured, tossing it farther, and he chased his bounds more fluid, the limp easing as joy loosened his muscles. The farmhouse, once a cavern of silence, felt warmer now, the air thick with the scent of earth and possibility. Clara's laughter echoed softly, drawing Rune closer each time he returned until he flopped beside her, panting, his head resting near her knee. The dawn light seeped through the farmhouse curtains like a hesitant promise, casting long shadows across the wooden floors where Clara sat, knees drawn to her chest, a mug of cooling coffee forgotten in her hands. Sleep had eluded her again, memories of Ezra swirling like leaves in the wind, his boyish grin as he taught Rune tricks, the dog's eager leaps a symphony of joy now silenced by time. Rune had been restless too, pacing the porch through the night, his limp less pronounced, but his eyes still haunted, as if the field's secrets weighed heavier in the quiet hours. She didn't call him in, respecting the invisible line they'd drawn, but as the first birdsong pierced the air, he paused at the doorway, silhouette framed in gold. The night air hung heavy in the farmhouse, thick with the scent of damp earth after a light rain, as Clara tossed in her bedsheets, tangled like the knots in her mind. Dreams clawed at her flames, licking the barn walls. Ezra's cries lost in the roar, Rune's silhouette fleeing into the smoke, waking her with a gasp, sweat beading on her skin like dew on the wheat. She sat up, heart pounding, the room's shadows twisting into shapes that whispered of unresolved loss. Downstairs, Rune stirred from his spot by the hearth, his ears pricking at an unseen presence, body going rigid as if the air itself carried a threat. The afternoon sun hung low, casting elongated shadows across the yard, like fingers reaching from the past as Peter approached the farmhouse, his boots crunching gravel with a hesitation that belied his usual steady gait. Rune, lounging beside Clara on the porch, snapped to attention, his body transforming in an instant, muscles coiling like spring's fur bristling along his spine, a deep growl erupting from his chest that vibrated the air like a warning siren. Clara's hand resting lightly on his back felt the tremor, her own heart lurching as memories flooded in the barn's inferno smoke, choking the night, Ezra's silhouette vanishing into the flames, while Rune howled in futile protest. Peter's face, familiar yet suddenly ominous, triggered at all his evasive eyes. The way he'd avoided questions about that night now amplifying Rune's aggression into something primal, rooted in the trauma of loss and unspoken guilt. The tension snapped like a frayed rope under strain as Peter, cornered by Rune's unrelenting stare and Clara's piercing questions, finally shattered the silence that had cloaked the farm in shadows for 2 long years. He stood there in the yard, the wheat fields swaying mockingly behind him, like witnesses to his guilt, his broad shoulders slumping, as if the weight of truth pressed down like an invisible hand. "Clara, I saw it all." He rasped his voice gravelly, eyes darting to Rune, who circled him now. Hackles raised a low rumble, building to a bark that cut the air like an accusation. Recognition was immediate. Rune's body language shifted to pure, primal confrontation. Muscles taut teeth flashing in the sunlight as memories of that night resurfaced, the barn ablaze. Ezra's heroic shove sending the dog tumbling out. Peter frozen at the door, watching the boy rush back in for a trapped foal, only for the roof to cave with a thunderous crack. The sun dipped low, painting the yard in crimson hues, like spilled blood drying on the earth, as the echoes of confrontation faded into a heavy hush. Peter rose unsteadily, his eyes averted, murmuring apologies that dissolved in the wind, before retreating to the barn's shadowed depths, his footsteps a retreating drumbeat of regret. Clara remained kneeling, her hands buried in Rune's fur, the dog's body still vibrating with residual tension, but his head turned to nuzzle her side, a quiet reaffirmation that anchored her amid the turmoil. Silence enveloped them like a shroud, broken only by the rustle of wheat as Clara's mind replayed Peter's words, Ezra's final act, the fire's merciless claim, the guilt that had kept truths buried. Regret washed over her in waves, not just for the lost years of unknowing, but for the distance she'd enforced with Rune, seeing now how his mourning had been a silent plea for shared healing. Twilight crept over the farm like a thief, the wheat fields shifting from gold to bruised purple, whispering warnings in the gathering breeze. Clara walked the perimeter fence, her lantern swinging in rhythmic arcs, casting erratic shadows that danced like elusive figures just beyond sight. Rune padded beside her, his ears pricked forward body language, a tapestry of watchfulness, tail low and stiff, nose twitching at scents carried on the wind, a soft whine escaping as he paused to stare into the encroaching dark. Subtle signs mounted, fresh tire tracks etched in the mud near the gate, not from Peter's truck but wider, aggressive, as if someone had idled there observing. A snapped twig underfoot made Clara jolt, her heart-quickening instincts flaring like Rune's hackles, which rose in a silent ridge along his spine. The farmhouse door burst open under a forceful shove, splintering the frame as the stranger barreled in his silhouette, hulking against the night eyes, wild with a possessiveness that chilled Clara to her core. He was the man from the rumors, the original owner, who'd abandoned Rune as a pup, now returned like a specter from the dog's tormented past. His voice a gravelly snarl. "That dog's mine, woman. Hand him over or I'll take him by force." Rune's response was immediate, a ferocious bark exploding from his throat body, positioning between Clara and the intruder, his limp forgotten in the surge of adrenaline, teeth bared in a gleam of white against the dim lantern light. The threat crystallized, unavoidable and visceral, the man's hand clutching a rusted chain, his stance aggressive, advancing with deliberate steps that echoed like judgments. Clara's heart hammered, flashbacks crashing like waves, Ezra's final push to save Rune from a similar cruelty, the fire's roar blending with this new peril. The stranger lunged, grabbing for Rune's collar, but the dog twisted, snapping at air inches from flesh, a direct confrontation that turned the room into a battlefield. Physical decline loomed. Clara's knees weakened, her breath shallow from the shock, while Rune's scars seemed to pulse his body, straining against old injuries, the imminent loss palpable. If the man succeeded, he'd rip away not just the dog, but the fragile thread of healing woven from Ezra's memory. The air reeked of sweat and fear, the man's threats escalating. "I'll put him down if I have to, worthless mutt!" Forcing the danger into sharp relief, no escape, only the raw edge of survival hanging by a thread. In the chaos of the farmhouse, time stretched like a taut wire, the stranger's chain whipping through the air toward Rune, who stood defiant, a growl vibrating through his frame like a vow unbroken. Clara's mind raced, the decision crystallizing in a heartbeat. Protect or lose everything again, echoes of Ezra's sacrifice, fueling her resolve. She couldn't let history repeat, couldn't watch another piece of her son be torn away. With a cry that shattered the tension, she surged forward, grabbing a fire poker from the hearth, its iron cold and heavy in her grip, swinging it not to harm but to deter the clang against the chain resounding like a declaration. "Get out! He's not yours anymore!" Her voice roared raw and maternal, transforming fear into fierce action as she positioned herself beside Rune, their bodies a united front. Rune, sensing her commitment, mirrored her stand, lunging, not wildly but strategically, teeth clamping onto the man's boot, pulling him off balance with a strength born from loyalty, his eyes flicking to Clara in a silent pact. The stranger stumbled, cursing, but pressed on his fist, raising in threat, forcing the choice deeper. Clara dropped the poker, opting instead for a desperate shove, her hands pushing against his chest with all her might, the physical clash a release of pent-up grief. "For Ezra." She whispered the words a catalyst as Rune released the boot and leaped paws on the man's shoulders, snarling inches from his face, the combined force driving him back toward the door. Emotional resolution washed over them, the bond forged in shared loss, now unbreakable. Clara's tears mixing with determination as she realized protection flowed both ways. She for him, he for her, an irreversible change that honored Ezra's legacy. As the stranger retreated into the night, defeated by their unity, Clara collapsed to her knees, arms encircling Rune, who licked her face with gentle insistence, his tail wagging faintly amid pants. The tension dissolved into catharsis, the decision to fight together sealing their fates, transforming vulnerability into strength. The farmhouse, once more a sanctuary, echoes of the confrontation fading into a profound shared peace. The farmhouse kitchen glowed softly under the single bulb, its light pooling like spilled honey on the worn table where Clara sat, her hands steady but slow as she unwound the bandage from Rune's paw, the fabric whispering against his fur. The stranger's retreat had left scratches, shallow lines etched in red, now cleaned and salved the air, carrying the faint sting of antiseptic mingled with the earth's damp breath from outside. Rune lay still on the rag rug, his eyes half-closed, chest rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to sync with the distant hum of crickets, no words needed between them, just the quiet cadence of survival. She moved with deliberate gentleness, dabbing ointment with fingers that lingered, tracing the scars older than this night, each touch a pause in the long sentence of their shared ordeal. Outside, the wheat fields slept under a blanket of stars, the oak standing guard in the distance, its branches no longer clawing, but swaying softly, as if exhaling the tension of the confrontation. Clara's own bruises, a welt on her arm, a ache in her side throbbed faintly, but she ignored them, focusing on Rune's slow blink, his tail giving a single lazy thump against the floor, a signal of trust renewed in the aftermath's hush. The emotional void lingered, a hollow space where fear had raged, now filling gradually with the peace of breath, shared movements minimal, her hand resting on his flank, his head shifting ever so slightly to press against her knee. No rush, no demands, just the slow unwinding of crisis bodies, decompressing in the sanctuary of home, the clock's tick, a gentle reminder that time for once was on their side. Morning light filtered through the curtains in golden threads, weaving patterns on the floor where Rune followed Clara to the kitchen, his steps soft and measured, the limp fading like a shadow retreating from the sun. She poured kibble into his bowl, the clatter of grains a steady tempo against the quiet hum of the farmhouse, and he waited, eyes meeting hers in a prolonged gaze, dark pools reflecting her own weariness, but softened now, a silent conversation where grief's edges blurred into understanding. He ate slowly, glancing up between bites, and Clara knelt nearby, her hand extending a scrap of bread which he took gently from her fingers, the brush of his muzzle warm, a small gesture that echoed through her like a ripple on still water. As days unfolded, their healing intertwined in sensory rhythms, the scent of fresh hay as Clara mended the fence, Rune trailing close, his nose twitching at the earth, pausing to lean against her leg. When she stopped his weight, a reassuring pressure that grounded her wandering thoughts. In the evenings by the hearth's crackling fire, orange flames dancing like forgotten joys, they lay side by side, her fingers combing through his fur in absent strokes, untangling knots as she unraveled her own tangled memories of Ezra. Rune's responses mirrored her progress, a nudge of his head under her chin, when tears came unbidden, his breath warm and rhythmic, syncing with her slowing pulse, weaving emotion into behavior without fanfare. Over time, the bond deepened through these interwoven moments. Clara rising earlier to walk the fields, Rune at her heel, their paces aligning in a steady cadence, the rustle of wheat underfoot, a soundtrack to recovery. He'd lie close during her quiet reflections, eyes locking in mutual acknowledgement, a small wag of tail responding to her whispered stories of Ezra turning solitude into companionship. Sensory details anchored them, the cool grass under paws and bare feet at dawn, the shared warmth of sun on fur and skin, the faint scent of rain, promising renewal. Clara's smiles came easier, prompted by Rune's playful rolls in the dirt, his invitations to toss a stick drawing her out of isolation, while he in turn accepted treats from her hand without hesitation, his trust a mirror to her emerging peace. Gradually, over weeks that blended into a tapestry of small actions following eating together, lying intertwined, their arcs converged emotions, healing in tandem, the farmhouse alive with the quiet symphony of two souls, mending one gesture at a time. The wheat parted like a golden sea as Clara and Rune approached the oak, its trunk a steadfast pillar under the vast sky, leaves rustling in a breeze that carried the faint scent of turning earth. In her palm, the locket gleamed dully, Ezra's photo inside a captured smile from brighter days, now a talisman of release. She knelt at the roots, fingers digging a shallow cradle in the soil, the dirt cool and yielding beneath her nails, each motion deliberate, a breath held in her chest. Rune watched, his eyes locked on hers, dark and knowing, then lowered his head to rest it against her thigh, the weight intimate, his breath warm and steady, syncing with the subtle rise of her own. As she placed the locket in the hollow and covered it gently, patting the earth smooth, Rune let out a soft hum, not a howl of loss, but a murmur of contentment, his body settling fully beside her fur, brushing her hand in a final, unexpected affirmation. Tears slipped down Clara's cheeks, not in sorrow but in quiet catharsis, her fingers curling into his coat, feeling the pulse beneath, alive, connected. The field sighed around them, shadows lengthening, but fear dissolved in that touch, eyes meeting in a gaze that promised eternity. Here, under the oak's watchful boughs, trust bloomed absolute, a rebirth whispered in breaths and glances, the past buried the future unfurling like dawn,